The day unfolded with a weight of significance for Leah Marshall. She wasn't merely presiding over a case today. The scales of justice themselves felt poised on her shoulders. As she approached the courthouse, a place that should have been a sanctuary of impartiality, an unforeseen drama played out right before its imposing doors. A white police officer, his face a mask of routine authority, stepped into her path, halting her progress. He didn't recognize the woman before him, the very arbiter of law he was meant to serve. This simple act, this casual disregard, thrust Leah headfirst into the very struggle that consumed her life. The insidious stain of racial bias, daring to rear its ugly head in the very halls where justice was meant to be blind. The weight of the impending trial pressed upon the judge as she walked those final few steps towards the courthouse entrance. But just as the grand doors loomed before her, the uniformed officer, oblivious to the power and purpose that resided within this woman, intercepted her. He demanded identification, a routine request that suddenly felt anything but. The scene was a stark paradox. A black judge, a guardian of the law, being subjected to the very prejudice she fought against daily, right on the threshold of where justice was supposed to prevail for all. Yet Leah was more than just a judge. She was a warrior for that very ideal. And this unexpected encounter was a stark reminder of the battles still left to be won. The familiar weight of the leather seat pressed against Leah Marshall as she emerged from the parked sedan. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the New Orleans sky in hues of orange and purple, but a heavier darkness lingered in her heart. Today was a fulcrum, a day where the scales of justice in this city could tilt in a significant way. The opening arguments of a landmark racial discrimination case hung in the air, thick with anticipation and the weight of history. A glance at her watch confirmed the dwindling minutes. 10 remained before the court was called to order. Encounters like this weren't foreign to her, but this particular day hummed with a unique, almost palpable significance. This was the case that could potentially reshape how Louisiana's legal system saw and ultimately addressed the deep-seated issue of racial prejudice within its communities. With a measured stride, Leah moved towards the courthouse, her ID badge a familiar weight, swinging gently against her chest. It was a constant, low hum of awareness, the subtle prickle of unseen eyes following her progress along the paved walkway. Deep down, Leah knew that not every gaze held respect, a reality she navigated daily. As the grand entrance drew closer, a figure caught her attention. A white police officer stood rigidly beside one of the side doors, his gaze immediately locking onto her. But Leah felt no alarm. She was Judge Marshall, an integral pillar of this very legal edifice. She had faced down far greater challenges within those hallowed halls. Yet the obstacle that now presented itself wasn't a trial of legal acumen, but a confrontation with the very prejudice she was sworn to dismantle. Reaching for her ID, preparing for the routine formality, Leah was stopped short. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification," the officer stated, his tone devoid of warmth. Leah paused, a flicker of surprise quickly masked by a practiced composure. This wasn't the first time, but the air crackled with an unusual tension. Holding her badge aloft, Leah kept her voice even, a carefully constructed dam against the rising tide of her frustration. "I am Judge Marshall, and I preside over the hearing commencing now. I need to enter." She couldn't fathom why she wasn't recognized. The officer remained impassive, his eyes scanning her with an unsettling scrutiny. Leah felt the coldness of his gaze, not the deference one afforded a judge, but the suspicion reserved for a potential threat. The officer didn't budge. "There's been an incident in the vicinity, and you fit the description," he stated, his voice lacking conviction, but laced with doubt. The words landed like a blow to Leah's stomach. Fit the description. The phrase echoed in the chambers of her mind, a painful reminder of countless instances where her skin had been enough to warrant suspicion. And now, here on the very steps of the courthouse, it was happening again. Anger simmered, but Leah refused to let it boil over. Her tone remained steady. "I don't have time for this. Court is about to begin." She held her ID higher, but the officer remained a steadfast barrier. She saw his hand drift subtly towards his sidearm, and a cold jolt of recognition shot through her. This tableau was tragically familiar. A black woman stopped, questioned, deemed out of place in someone else's eyes. "You'll have to come with me," the officer's voice hardened, and Leah's eyes flickered down to the subtle movement of his hand edging closer to the handcuffs on his belt. For a fleeting moment, the carefully constructed world around Leah seemed to crumble. She had prepared for the battle within the courtroom, but now she found herself fighting a different kind of battle on its very doorstep. This was a struggle she hadn't anticipated, a stark reminder of the obstacles that still lay between her and the pursuit of justice. But the taut silence, the surge of Leah's emotions, lasted only a heartbeat. A different voice, deep and resonant with authority, cut through the tense air from behind her. "What's going on here?" Leah turned to see an older black officer approaching, his bearing suggesting rank and experience. A wave of relief, subtle yet profound, washed over her at the sight of a potential ally, someone who might finally cut through this senseless obstruction. Leah felt the walls closing in, an invisible pressure pushing her back, until a deep, resonant voice cut through the tense air. "What's going on here?" Turning, Leah saw a black police officer approaching. He was older, his face etched with a quiet authority, his posture the confident stance of someone who had witnessed the many shades of human nature in his time on the force. A wave of relief, small but significant, washed over Leah at his presence. This was the intervention she needed. The younger officer seemed to register the shift in the dynamic, though no flicker of remorse crossed his features. The older officer stepped closer, placing a firm hand on the younger man's shoulder, his command quiet but absolute. "Stand down." The younger officer's gaze flickered towards his colleague, suspicion still clouding his eyes. "She fits the description," he muttered, his focus unwavering on Leah. The older officer's eyes locked onto his, a gaze that was both stern and unwavering. "This is Judge Leah Marshall. She's presiding over the very case we're here for. And if you don't cease this immediately, I will be reporting you." Leah stood there, the breath she hadn't realized she was holding still caught in her throat. This intervention felt fragile, a temporary reprieve. Yet the older officer's unwavering stance had its effect. The younger man took a reluctant step back, his gaze finally loosening its grip, though only momentarily. He swallowed hard, offering no further argument, remaining rooted to the spot as the older officer turned his attention fully to Leah. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice softening. Leah took a deep breath, struggling to regain her composure. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice a little rough. "Thank you." In that moment, Leah was reminded that not everyone within this system was cut from the same cloth as the young officer. But the encounter had laid bare a stark and unwelcome truth. No matter her title, no matter her position, the color of her skin would always be a defining factor in some eyes. The older officer regarded her with a serious expression, a hint of understanding in his gaze. "Let me escort you inside," he offered, gesturing towards the side entrance. "You need to get to your courtroom. We don't have much time." Leah nodded, feeling as though she had just weathered a small, personal storm. But the encounter lingered. The image of the young officer, his defiant suspicion, the sheer absurdity of being stopped, all of it replayed in her mind. Time, however, was a luxury she couldn't afford. The court awaited. So, taking another steadying breath, Leah pushed down the turmoil and stepped into the courthouse, the very place where justice was meant to reside. The familiar sounds of the building enveloped her as she crossed the threshold, but her thoughts remained tethered to the encounter outside. She had faced prejudice throughout her career, but the incident at the door had brought a stark realization into sharp focus. Racism wasn't just an external societal ill. It was a deeply ingrained presence, capable of reaching into the very sanctuaries of justice. And today, Leah knew she wasn't just presiding over a case. She was stepping onto a larger battlefield, the fight against the insidious biases that permeated the very system she served. Stepping through the heavy oak door of the courtroom, Leah was enveloped by the familiar chill of the high ceilings, the solemnity of the wooden benches, and the pervasive silence that always seemed to hang in the air. She had stood on this dais countless times, a silent witness to the unfolding dramas of justice, but today felt different. A palpable weight settled in the room, a collective breath held in anticipation. Every eye seemed to rest on her, waiting for the guidance of the judge. Yet within Leah, a storm of questions and complex emotions brewed. Sinking into the high-backed judge's chair, Leah's gaze fell upon the thick file detailing the case. But, no matter how diligently she tried to center herself, the encounter at the courthouse doors clung to her thoughts like a persistent shadow. She replayed the suspicion, the cold indifference in the young officer's eyes, the way he had treated her as an outsider, not as the very arbiter of law about to preside over a significant trial. It was a stark, painful reminder. No matter your achievements, no matter your place, the color of your skin could still paint you as other. Her gaze drifted across the room to Kevin Daniels, seated on the other side, his young face etched with a palpable tension. He was a man caught in a battle not of his making, the relentless fight against racial prejudice that had stained his own neighborhood. Leah couldn't help but see a reflection of her younger self, the sting of similar biases still echoing in her memory. Leah's eyes scanned the case file once more. Kevin Daniels, a young black man, apprehended by the police while simply waiting for a bus in his own community. The justification offered by the officers was that he looked like he didn't belong, leading to a stop, questioning, and ultimately suspicion of an unspecified wrongdoing. The insidious questions of prejudice, of actions without explanation, swirled in Leah's mind. She remembered the initial report, a young man stripped of his freedom based solely on the color of his skin and his geographical location. And now, she was the one tasked with delivering justice for him. As the trial commenced, Leah began to call the witnesses. Each step onto the stand, each oath taken, amplified the underlying tension in the room, a tension Leah felt acutely, despite her practiced composure. The police testimonies circled back to the reasons for Kevin's arrest, yet everything remained frustratingly vague. He looked out of place, they claimed, offering no concrete evidence of any actual crime. Leah could sense the subtle shiftiness in their responses, the lack of conviction as they faced the glaring absence of justification. A dawning realization settled upon Leah. This case wasn't just about Kevin's individual struggle. It was a microcosm of a larger community's pain. He was not alone. Millions like him had been subjected to this kind of treatment simply because they were different. And this prejudice wasn't confined to the streets. It had seeped into the very fabric of the courtroom, the very system Leah was a part of. The question gnawed at her. Could this system truly change? Or would it forever protect those in power while overlooking the voiceless? When Kevin Daniels finally took the stand, his voice, though soft, resonated with a profound pain as he recounted the humiliation of being treated like a criminal simply for being black. He spoke of the arbitrary arrest, the feeling of his freedom being stolen because he didn't belong. His words hung in the air, a powerful indictment, not only of the officers involved, but of the larger system that allowed such injustices to persist. A deep empathy stirred within Leah. Kevin's story wasn't just his own. It was the story of countless others who navigated a world colored by prejudice. It was, in many ways, her story too, a stark reminder of the times she had faced subtle and not so subtle dismissals, simply because of the color of her skin. Each testimony from victims like Kevin was a painful but necessary call for systemic change. Leah looked at Kevin, and in that moment, she wasn't just a judge. She was a fellow warrior in the fight for equality. She would not let him become another statistic, another example of injustice swept under the rug. She would use every ounce of her authority to ensure he found the justice he deserved. As Kevin Daniels took the stand, a palpable weight settled over the courtroom. He wasn't the first to testify, but as the collective gaze of everyone present focused on him, Leah felt a shift, as if all the attention in the room now centered on this young man. She observed him, the invisible scars of prejudice etched onto his youthful face. His eyes didn't quite meet anyone's directly, a slight haze lingering in them, as if he were searching for the truth within the confines of his own memory. Leah gently tapped her gavel, the sound amplifying the already profound silence, and all eyes remained fixed on him, waiting for his voice. "Kevin, can you please recount for the court what happened on that day?" Leah asked, her tone measured, yet a subtle undercurrent of tension betrayed the weight of the moment. Kevin raised his head, his gaze now steadier, though a flicker of apprehension still danced within it. He began to speak, and his story filled the courtroom, clear and direct, yet laced with an undeniable pain. "That day, I was just waiting for the bus. I was standing on the corner, looking at my phone like I do every day. Nothing felt out of the ordinary. Then a police car just pulled up right beside me. They didn't say anything at first, just got out and started asking me all these questions that didn't make any sense. Why was I there? Was I wanted for something? What had I done wrong?" Kevin's voice deepened as he continued. "I was just a black kid, waiting for the bus, in my own neighborhood. But I guess to them I was a suspect just because I didn't fit there." He paused, taking a slow, deliberate breath. "There was no reason for them to stop me. I hadn't done anything. They just saw me as an outsider, and that was enough to treat me like a criminal." Leah sat in silence, her own heart clenching with each of Kevin's words. These weren't just random statements. They were the echoes of countless experiences, the shared pain of those who had been judged and found wanting based on nothing more than their appearance. People like Kevin, stopped and questioned without cause, simply because they lacked the inherent privilege to be unquestioned, labeled as suspects by a society quick to cast judgment. "The police didn't have any reason to hold me," Kevin continued, his voice gaining a slight tremor. "They just pushed me into the back of their car and took me to the station without even telling me why. They didn't have any evidence, they just looked at me, and in their eyes, I looked like someone who didn't belong. That was it." Leah could hear the raw emotion in Kevin's voice, the stifled indignation. She couldn't help but feel the injustice of his story. She had heard accounts like this before, but hearing it directly from the young man, the reality of it felt sharper, more visceral. These were the lives pushed to the margins, the individuals stripped of their basic rights simply because of the color of their skin. Kevin paused again, his gaze briefly meeting Leah's. "They didn't just hurt me. They hurt my family, my community. And they're hurting everyone who looks like me, who are treated like our lives don't matter." A bitter taste rose in Leah's throat, but she maintained her outward composure. She glanced towards the young police officer who had initiated the stop, his face impassive as he listened to Kevin's testimony. Kevin's words hung in the air, a silent accusation directed at him, and at the very system he represented. Never before had the weight of this case felt so immense, so deeply personal. Leah understood with stark clarity that this wasn't just the isolated struggle of Kevin Daniels. It was the collective fight of all those marginalized by a justice system that too often turned a blind eye to prejudice, those deemed out of place by arbitrary social constructs. Kevin concluded his testimony with a statement that was both powerful and profoundly simple. "I just want to be treated like a human being. Nothing more, nothing less." His words resonated in the quiet courtroom, a stark reminder of the ultimate goal of every battle against racial discrimination. A world where equality and respect were not privileges, but fundamental rights for all, regardless of who they were. Leah absorbed his words, the truth of them settling deep within her. In that moment, she knew that justice couldn't stop here. Today, she would do everything in her power to deliver a verdict that was not only fair to Kevin, but also a step towards a more just world for all those who continued to face the insidious sting of prejudice. A heavier stillness descended upon the courtroom as the young police officer, Bill Wilkins, took the stand. His tension was palpable. His hands trembled slightly, and Leah could discern a distinct lack of confidence in his every step. This officer wasn't just a witness. He was the accused, the individual whose actions had inflicted the very racial discrimination Kevin Daniels had endured. Each of Bill's movements felt like a reluctant prelude to the exposure of mistakes he clearly wished to avoid confronting. Leah's gaze remained fixed on him. She knew Bill's testimony would be crucial, yet she also understood the internal conflict raging within him, the push and pull between the demands of justice and the fear of facing the truth of his own actions. "Officer Wilkins," Leah began, her tone firm but not overtly harsh, carrying just enough weight to convey the gravity of the situation. "Please tell the court why you decided to stop Mr. Kevin Daniels, who was simply waiting for a public bus, without any apparent cause." Bill hesitated for a beat, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a plausible explanation within its very architecture. He glanced towards the gallery, perhaps seeking some form of unspoken support, but met only the heavy silence of the observers and the unwavering gazes of the jury. I was on patrol in the area, and he looked like he didn't belong in that neighborhood," Bill stammered, his voice lacking conviction, as if he were trying to convince himself of a justification that didn't exist. Leah couldn't ignore the inherent ambiguity in Bill's statement. This answer wasn't just illogical. It laid bare a deep-seated prejudice that was impossible to deny. Leah turned her gaze briefly to Kevin, then back to meet Bill's eyes directly. She could no longer remain silent. "He looked like he didn't belong?" Leah repeated, her gaze unwavering. Could you elaborate on what didn't belong means in this context, Officer Wilkins? Can you point to any discernible difference between Mr. Daniels and anyone else in that neighborhood that warranted your suspicion? Leah's question landed like a sharp crack, shattering any semblance of composure Bill might have been clinging to. He began to fidget, his eyes losing their initial defensiveness. I just saw him standing there, and I thought he might be a suspect, Bill offered, his voice barely strong enough to carry across the quiet courtroom. He faltered, his words losing their footing, devoid of any real substance. Leah watched him, Bill's words like disjointed pieces of a puzzle that simply didn't fit. She had reviewed the case file, listened to the other testimonies, and now, faced with Bill's flimsy justification, the stark reality of his bias became undeniable. He had seen Kevin simply as a black man in a neighborhood he had arbitrarily deemed not his. So, what evidence did you have to suggest Mr. Daniels was a suspect? Leah pressed, not allowing him to retreat. Did you check his identification? Or did you simply assume he was a suspect because of the color of his skin? Bill fell silent, the weight of Leah's question hanging heavy in the air. She could sense his internal struggle, the dawning realization of his error. Finally he sighed, his head bowing slightly. And in that moment, Leah knew that Bill understood he had been wrong. But that belated recognition couldn't undo the harm he had caused. I didn't find anything, Bill mumbled, his voice barely a whisper, as if acknowledging the futility of his words to justify his actions. Leah regarded him, saying nothing for a long moment. Bill's testimony was a stark reflection of the very system she was fighting against. This wasn't just the misstep of one officer. It was a symptom of a larger disease, the deeply rooted racial bias that permeated the justice system. And today she would not allow that injustice to stand unchallenged. So you were wrong, Leah finally stated, her voice unwavering, imbued with a quiet but firm resolve. You judged Kevin Daniels simply because he is a black man, and you acted without any legitimate reason. Leah gave Bill no opportunity for further explanation. At this point, words could not erase the reality of what had transpired. She turned her gaze towards the jury, a silent communication passing between them, a shared understanding that what unfolded in this courtroom today held profound implications for the very fabric of justice in their society. Leah keenly observed the subtle shift in the courtroom's atmosphere as Officer Bill Wilkins finally relinquished his grip on self-justification. Her pointed questions had not only forced him to confront the glaring flaws in his actions, but had also compelled him to look inward, perhaps for the first time. The confident glint that had initially flickered in Bill's eyes was now replaced by a palpable confusion and unease. He knew deep down that the flimsy excuses he had offered couldn't mask the undeniable truth. He had discriminated against Kevin, based solely on the color of his skin. A heavy silence blanketed the courtroom, every occupant waiting for Bill's next utterance. Leah, too, remained quiet, allowing him the space to wrestle with the reality he had so stubbornly avoided. The passing moments felt like a test, not just for Bill, but for the entire justice system represented within those walls. She understood that any further resistance from the officer would only serve to highlight the inherent shortcomings of that system. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Bill looked up, the confident facade completely gone, replaced by a dawning awareness and a hint of remorse. He took a deep, shuddering breath, as if bracing himself for a profound internal reckoning. I know I was wrong, Bill's voice was hoarse, heavy with a belated apology. "I shouldn't have stopped him. I let my own biases guide my decision." Leah offered no immediate response. She allowed Bill the space to articulate this newfound shift in his understanding. But in her heart, she knew that words alone could never fully mend the wounds his actions had inflicted. Not just on Kevin, but on the very community he was sworn to serve. Still, Leah recognized that true change wasn't instantaneous. Bill was only just beginning to acknowledge his error, and whether that initial recognition would blossom into genuine transformation remained a significant question. "Do you understand the impact of your actions?" Leah asked, her gaze unwavering. "The racial profiling you engaged in doesn't just affect Kevin. It erodes the trust of an entire community, damaging their faith in the very system you represent. How do you propose to rebuild that trust?" Bill didn't answer immediately. He lowered his head, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand, as if searching for an explanation that remained elusive. Ultimately, only silence answered Leah's pointed question. She didn't need to hear any further justifications. The truth was already starkly evident. The price of change wasn't always a simple apology. It was the tangible execution of justice, the acceptance of wrongdoing, and a committed effort towards internal transformation. "What you've said is a start, but it doesn't undo what you did," Leah stated, her voice soft yet resolute. "An apology is necessary, but it is action that will truly change this system. You need to understand that justice cannot be a gentle pat on the wrist. It must be a decisive act." A newfound steel settled within Leah, not just in her words, but in the way she faced the entirety of the system that was now testing her. No, she would not easily forgive this act of racial discrimination. And today she would be the one to demand justice for Kevin, for all those like him, who were rendered voiceless in a society still grappling with deeply ingrained prejudice and bias. Leah's gaze swept across the members of the jury, a silent plea for them to understand that it wasn't just Kevin Daniels' case that lay before them. The very integrity of their justice system was on trial. And once more, she silently reminded herself that this battle wouldn't end with this verdict. Every step she took today was a small part of a long and arduous journey, one where she would have to contend not only with officers like Bill, but with a system that had become far too comfortable with the insidious presence of discrimination. A tense silence descended upon the courtroom as Leah turned back to her bench, preparing for the final act of the trial. All eyes remained fixed on her, some reflecting anxiety, others a hopeful anticipation. In this charged atmosphere, Leah felt the weight of the system she navigated, but also the unwavering resolve to continue her fight for fairness. With a sharp rap of her gavel, Leah called for order. "The court is ready to deliver its verdict," she announced, pausing for a beat, as if allowing the weight of her words to settle. She glanced down at the case files once more, attempting to absorb every crucial detail. But in truth, Leah no longer needed to look. The essence of the case was etched in her mind. This wasn't just the story of one man, it was a resounding message to the justice system itself. Throughout the trial, Leah had not only listened to the testimonies, but had also witnessed the weary defensiveness of Officer Bill Wilkins and the undeniable truth presented by Kevin Daniels. She couldn't ignore the fact that while Bill's apologies and reflections might hold a sliver of change, they could never fully repair the damage his actions had wrought. The cost of racial discrimination couldn't be measured in mere words. It demanded tangible action and justice. Leah's gaze swept slowly across each member of the jury, their faces etched with a mixture of apprehension and expectation. Finally, she took a deep breath, her eyes falling upon her written findings before delivering the ultimate decision. There was a stark inevitability to it. Yet it was not without a profound sense of sorrow as she began to speak. "We find the defendant, Officer Bill Wilkins, guilty of unlawful detention, resulting in clear racial discrimination against Mr. Kevin Daniels," Leah declared, her voice strong and unequivocal. A subtle wave of release seemed to ripple through the courtroom. But Leah knew this verdict was merely a single step in a much larger battle. These words couldn't deliver complete and absolute justice, but in this moment, they held a significant weight. Kevin sat still, his eyes fixed on the wall ahead, as if unable to fully comprehend that a measure of justice had finally been served. Leah saw a flicker of relief and something akin to forgiveness in his gaze. He remained silent, but Leah could almost hear his internal acknowledgement. At least, today, he had not been ignored. Across the room, Bill Wilkins stood, his face ashen, a stark contrast to his initial air of authority. His hands remained clenched, but their grip no longer held the same confident tension. He didn't meet Leah's eyes, instead staring at the floor, the ground upon which he had made such irreparable missteps. The heavy atmosphere in the courtroom wasn't solely due to the verdict Leah had just delivered. It stemmed from a deeper, more unsettling truth. The system had faltered. It had allowed actions like these to occur, had permitted individuals like Bill Wilkins to wield unchecked power, and now the burden of that injustice continued to weigh upon people like Kevin. Leah turned her gaze back to the jury, a weariness mingled with unwavering determination in her eyes. She knew this verdict was but a fraction of the larger fight. The justice system needed to evolve, not just in one isolated case, but in every instance where individuals like Kevin Daniels faced the daily indignity of prejudice. With a final resounding rap of her gavel, Leah declared, "This court is adjourned for the day. Thank you." Despite the pronouncement, a heavy weight remained in Leah's chest. She knew that while the system had suffered a small defeat, the larger struggle was far from over. Today, Leah wasn't just a judge. She was a continuing warrior for justice, not just for one individual, but for all those left behind by the persistent inequalities of their society. Leah remained seated in the judge's chair, watching the courtroom slowly empty. The crowd had dispersed. Lawyers gathered their files, and the participants of the day's drama began to filter back into the rhythm of their ordinary lives. Yet Leah couldn't shake the whirlwind of thoughts churning within her. This trial, though concluded, had only underscored the deep-seated injustices, the ingrained biases, and the persistent problems that plagued the very system she served. Justice had been delivered to Kevin Daniels, but Leah knew it was a mere ripple in a vast ocean of ongoing struggle. She raised a hand to gently rub her forehead, her eyes closing for a fleeting moment. A bone-deep weariness seemed to settle over her, yet she couldn't afford to succumb to it. This trial, like every trial before it, was more than just a task to be completed. It was the tangible manifestation of the responsibility she carried. Each time she delivered a verdict, each time she stood before those who had suffered injustice, she knew she was more than just a judge. She was a vessel for change. A soft knock on the door pulled Leah from her reverie. She looked up to see Kevin Daniels standing in the doorway with his lawyer. Kevin's gaze was calmer than before, but Leah could still detect the lingering fatigue in his posture. Kevin stepped into the room and offered a quiet nod. "Judge Marshall," he said, his voice low and filled with emotion. "I just wanted to thank you. Thank you for doing what was right. This trial wasn't just about me. It was about all the people like me." Leah offered a small, gentle smile in return, but a sense of hollowness echoed within her. She didn't quite know what to say. Thank him? but she didn't feel she had done anything extraordinary. She had simply done her job. Yet Kevin's words resonated, reminding her that her work transcended mere legal proceedings. It held the power to impact lives like his, and that pursuit of fairness was an integral part of her own journey. "Kevin," Leah said, her voice soft but firm, "no one should be treated like that. No one should be judged based on the color of their skin or where they come from. But you had the courage to stand up, and that's what matters most." Kevin looked at her, a faint smile gracing his lips. "Thank you, ma'am," he repeated, then turned to his lawyer. "We should go." Leah watched them leave, a heavy feeling settling in her chest as the door closed behind them. Though justice had been served in this instance, Leah knew it wasn't the end. She had heard Kevin's story and knew there were countless others like him, individuals stripped of their basic human dignity simply because they didn't fit into a world crafted by those in power. Leah rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the sprawling cityscape of New Orleans. The bright lights reflected against the night sky, but beneath that glittering facade, the stories of pain and undeniable truths continued to unfold. The justice system still needed to evolve, and Leah knew she would have to continue this fight, one step at a time. She turned back to her desk, her eyes falling upon the remaining case files. Each document, each testimony, represented a life she was sworn to protect. Others within the system might move on, might forget what had transpired, but Leah would not. She would continue to push, even knowing the path ahead would be arduous. But there was no other choice. Justice couldn't be a fleeting victory, and she would be its unwavering guardian. Leah took a deep breath, a sense of quiet resilience settling within her. She had fought in this courtroom, and she would continue to fight for change, for justice, not just for people like Kevin, but for all those marginalized by the inequities of their society. "We have to keep going," Leah murmured to herself, "because they deserve it." And as she finally walked out of the silent courtroom, she knew this was just one small step in a long and unwavering journey. A journey she would never abandon.